Today we're going to look at the Columbian Exchange, or as I call it, mega diffusion. Now, at its most basic level as definition, the Columbian Exchange was the transfer of people, animals, plants, and diseases between the New and the Old World, more specifically the Western and the Eastern hemispheres. Now, as a result of some of the later invasions of the 15th and 16th century in the previous time period, things like the Crusades and stuff like that, you have an opening up of the pathways between East and West, right? The Old World and the New World. Europeans in particular are going to want to start heading their way towards the Orient to get their hands on trade goods from that eastern section, but they don't want to go through Muslim-controlled territories anymore of the western half of the Silk Road. So they're trying to find water routes to do that. And the Columbian Exchange is one in a line of many diffusions that we've seen. And some examples are for you the Mongols, the spread of Islam, the spread of Hellenistic Greece culture through Alexander the Great. The Roman Empire was one. I think the most intensive one that we've seen, probably, that would be the most important, would be the Neolithic Revolution with the ideas of farming. But this has to be certainly well connected to those and is probably the second most important besides Neolithic Revolution here. In contrast, you've got the initiation of contact and exchange, where previously none of that had existed before. We are just now starting to scratch the surface of the Mesoamerican world, and we will only start to do that because Europeans are going to come over and sail over and directly contact with native populations. This is a good thing and a bad thing for the parties involved. You can argue as to who benefits greater and who benefits the least from this relationship. That question will be posed to you by the end, and hopefully you'll be able to have some kind of way of arguing that depending on which direction you're leaning. Now, the most important initial result of the Columbian Exchange is demographic changes. So you can't underscore the importance of disease and its effect on the Americas, and in particular the indigenous populations, the Amerindians, who are being addressed by their European counterparts for the first time. The people of the New World, they're devastated from Europeans coming over in many ways, one of which is disease. And so they do not have immunities towards certain diseases brought over from the Old World, mainly because a lot of the diseases that are giving them problems get their start with animals and populations that are catching things through, contact with certain labor or domesticated animals. And as we have previously covered, the Americas don't really have domesticated animals like the Old World has. They really only have the llama and maybe the turkey, if you consider that to be a domesticated animal. So they're going to be hit really hard by these diseases because they don't have immunity towards them. That's one of the most significant exchanges at first is disease here. And of course, the two worlds, as put here in the slide, living in isolation from one another for thousands of years. The Old World has tons and tons of diseases over time that they become accustomed to. And of course, bubonic plague as an example, and there are way more other things there as well. Resistance is the result of that for the Europeans. And so once again, in contrast, that last little note, the Amerindians are sharing the same genetic points across their lines, but nowhere near their Old World cousins, to where that makes them very, very vulnerable to disease and catching, and especially the diseases that the Europeans are going to bring over. So as we continue on with demographic transitions and the discussions of that, pre-Columbian natives are so fortunate in regards to disease that they lie in disease reservoirs. Once again, populations of animals, pigs, cows, chickens, sheep, all of those things come in contact with humans, and therefore humans over time develop immunities to those. The Americas do not have that, and so therefore, those animals will die out if they do ever get sick before there is epidemics that would lead to eventual resistance. As a result here, the death rates in the early colonial period are extremely high, as you can probably imagine. Some historians point that to 50 to 80% are going to do the initial perishing. So we're seeing a population of, 33 to 50 million, depending on what you're looking at as far as data, dwindling down to 4.5. And in fact, there are instances, especially in the West Indies and some of the Caribbean islands, where people like Columbus, for example, will come over, note that the natives are in perfect health, and by the time he comes back on his second voyage, there's zero population on this island. And so the death and destruction that Europeans brought, once again, please do not underscore the importance of that kind of devastation. And in some ways, this is a deliberate devastation. Don't forget that the Europeans are coming over. Once they make initial contact, they have economic, political interest at mind. So they're trying to take any kind of leverage they can to eliminate the threat of native revolt and revolution against them coming over and taking over. So, for example, Cortez, 1521, beyond the brutal tactics he has on the battlefield, he does try, in fact, to give disease, in this case, blankets that were infested with disease, to inhabitants of the native populations. You're going to see populations dwindle in Mexico from 13 to 25 million all the way down to 700,000 people. The Maya, same thing. We got 75% of them disappearing. The Incas are even harder hit. 9 million to 600,000 people estimated are lost due to, once again, devastation by disease. And then, of course, the main culprit for this is smallpox. 1518 in the Caribbean is when this is first noted as being arriving. 50% of the Amerindian population within the first wave dies, and then of course a giant chunk dies in other waves after that because immunity has still not been brought up. Measles are also a big one here. There's lots of other ones like the flu and typhus and whooping cough. Anything that can spread in an unsanitary type condition like some of these places have will be very deadly. Any kind of disease that involves transformation through humid conditions also is going to be ripe for spread here in South America, Central America, where it's extremely hot, extremely humid, and it's hard to kick those kinds of fevers and stuff like that. The 1650s, which is right in the middle of this time period, features the deadliest form of malaria, and that comes over through African slaves. So it's not just the Europeans that are bringing diseases that devastate the population in the local area. It is also African slaves that are brought over for labor. They bring their own forms of disease, and actually they do damage to both the natives and Europeans, because the Europeans don't have contact with malaria in massive amount until this time period either. Now, this starts a wave of kind of revenge that's going to happen, because obviously what works for one will also work for the other. So the Amerindians have their own diseases that the Europeans are not used to, mainly stuff like syphilis and stuff like that. And it's believed to be transferred from the Americas to Europe. Right around 1500, you see a high mortality rate in certain communities of European countries that have outbreaks of syphilis. And that, of course, it's not equal in the terms of the amount of death that happens between the two, but there is a little bit of deliberate devastation part two there. Obviously, colonies in North America are going to follow similar outbreaks. Not as much overall numbers of devastation, but there is still devastation happening from that give and that take of disease. So when we look at other non-disease transferring groups, the first one we're going to look at is plants. This is a radical change that's about to happen, and it's about to happen in things like diet and lifestyle between the Old World and the New World. So the Europeans give many, many major plants and staple crops and vegetables and fruits and stuff over to the New World: wheat, olives, grapes, garden vegetables, all of these crops that are going to kind of blend in with Asian and African crops that are going to be coming over, like rice and bananas and coconuts, and sugar cane's a huge one because that's going to be the new staple crop in places like Brazil, where it grows really well. Same thing in the Caribbean islands. And in exchange, the Americans, or the Americas, I should say, are giving some staple crops back to places where they're going to be very influential. Corn, or maize as it's known. Potatoes, they got several varieties of that, both regular and sweet. Beans of all different varieties, squash, cassava, which is a root vegetable, etc. A lot of these things are going to be extremely influential in new places. Take, for example, Northern Ireland and Northern European countries that have typically rocky and cold climates and soil patterns. Not a lot of staple crops grow well in those areas. Potatoes do grow well in those areas, coming from the Andes Mountains, of course. So that's going to be a major influence. Corn, as we know, because we live in a modern world that is dependent on corn for many, many reasons, that's going to be really important. Different root vegetables and stuff get traded back to Africa in exchange for slaves, and that's going to be helpful for keeping up their numbers with their agricultural booms that are going to be happening soon. So lots and lots of diffusion here, and that given that take is going to be really impactful short term and long term. So once again, America, we talked about a little bit of this today, or the previous slide for today. Corn, especially when it starts moving into the major population areas of Europe and China. China today is the second largest producer of corn next to the U.S. So, there's a major impact here, economically speaking and socially speaking, because corn, once again, as a staple crop, provides another variety of caloric intake that'll be helpful for massive populations and keeping those numbers going. Corn especially produces more food per acre than most of its competitors, with the exception of probably potatoes. I think most statistics look at. As far as negatives here, corn is not perfect, as you can't just live on corn, right? Like corn chips and tortillas and all that kind of stuff. Certain amino acids and vitamins are not in corn, so it kind of gets used as feed for cattle at first, and then people realize that it really is good if you just supplement it with other vitamins and fruits and stuff. And it also requires more water than wheat and other grains, so you've got to be more impactful there on the environment. So looking at I as far as your spice characteristic, environment stuff definitely needs to be talked about there. The potato, once again, in the Andes Mountains, it's going to be really impactful in Northern Europe or European countries that have mountainy, rocky soil type of environments. So northern Spain, the Irish, parts of Germany, of course, Russia. There's a lot of food you can produce per acre with that. So almost up to 4 times the amount of some cereal grains like rye, for example. And this actually does offer a balanced nutrition that can be eaten exclusively almost by itself. And so, there's some issues that go along with that. Grain having to be harvested and stored, for example, has a very short shelf life if you, for example, introduce moisture or, bad temperatures, whereas potatoes could be left in the ground all winter, and then as long as they're, dug up, they'd be fine, right? They're getting covered up by soil and dirt that's keeping it insulated there. Other things, once again, cassava going to Africa and Asia, beans, squash, tomatoes are going to make their way over and become part of the cuisine. Peanuts, chilies, which is going to be introduced as like folk medicine and for taste for bland foods. Finally, chocolate. We know how the importance of chocolate on a global scale and what that is now. That gets its start during this discussion. Many results coming from that. You've got a major population boom that's about to start happening. Moving forward, we're going to go from about 500 million people estimated when Columbus makes his first voyage over to right around 6 billion, 7 billion today, actually. So, that's all happening because of the variety in diet that's being introduced through some of these initial exchanges. And then, of course, other advantages and disadvantages. I listed some for you there as well. Other plants we maybe didn't talk about that need to be included. Things like indigo to make dyes certainly has an economic impact. Medicinal plants coming from the old world to the new world or vice versa offer social impacts. Cotton is going to be spreading and will become majorly economically impactful in certain areas like, say, for example, North America. We're eventually going to make the switch from tobacco to cotton as a cash crop. And tobacco domesticated forms growing in South America are going to be useful for their effects they have when you smoke it, obviously, which is going to be useful in ceremonies, both religious and non-religious. And of course, Europeans really get attracted to tobacco due to those effects, so much so that by the 1700s, cultural identities like smoking pipes and stuff like that are going to happen. And of course, nowadays we know the impact of tobacco with the cigarette industry here and if nowhere else, this country. Some things that are coming from Europe that are going to be, going to the Americas here include staple crops like wheat and stuff, but they also include things that don't on the surface seem important, but long-lasting impacts are incredibly important. Olives, chickpeas, for example, palm oil, which grows really well in more humid tropical climates. Bananas, once again, coming from Africa, are going to come over and become a major staple crop grown in South America. Sugarcane is by far the most important thing coming over initially because of its impact on the industry types that are going to be happening if the Spanish, the Portuguese, some of the English and French colonies in the Caribbean and stuff like that. Sugarcane, majorly important, and it also leads us to the use of African slaves because it's a very labor-intensive crop. African slaves have a former use for that over in their own continent, and so they already know how to do this, and so they're going to be useful for that, and so people are going to start buying them and trading them. You got tons of varieties of vegetables and fruit, anything from apples all the way to cabbage, turnips and carrots to spinach and garlic, cherries. There's a ton there for you. So once again, Europe is giving lots of good things over to the New World as well. The other non-disease transferring group is animals, and so this is all about domestication. Domesticated animals have a dramatic effect in the New World. The New World has lots of animals that have had predators and stuff due to conditions that have not allowed for domestication of a lot of those animals. As a result, when you start bringing over domesticated animals from the old world, like cattle and pigs and horses and goats and sheep, as well as pests like rats and rabbits that breed really quickly and all that kind of stuff, you're going to have lots of impacts from that. One of those that's underscored is the introduction of wild varieties of animals into the nature that get escaped, like cattle and horses, and some places develop a notoriety for having wild horses or wild cattle and all that kind of stuff. By 1700, it's estimated 50 million wild horses and cattle roam southern South America and parts up into North America as well. A lot of these animals destroy the Amerindian farm settlements. So, for example, animals that graze a lot, like sheep or cows and whatever, they take a lot of food to get going. So that's going to be a big strain on areas that don't typically have tons of open real estate because they live in more humid, jungly type of locations. However, cattle provide meat if they're caught. Horses provide transportation if you can kind of wrangle them in and teach them and coach them to be more calm. Those things do provide some positives. Hides especially as well for keeping warm in the winter months in certain areas. Those are some good things here, that exchange. Once again, one of the biggest dramatic results that happens to the culture of the Amerindians is the introduction of the horse. Wild horses are going to be becoming more and more herd-like, and they're going to be moving throughout spots of Central into North America. The main transportation style of the Spanish in particular allows that diffusion to happen a little bit more quickly, since the Spanish are one of the first ones on the scene. And of course, by the 1520s, horses actually adapt pretty well to our environment here in the Americas. And so certain Indian tribes, like the Great Plains people, do capture and use horses for their use in their cavalries and stuff like that, or to ride and do raids and whatnot. And of course, originally the North American Plain Indians were settled farmers, and of course horses allow them to move quite quickly. So much so that different industries, as a result, pick up off the back of the horses, like bison hunting, until we, of course, kill most of them out. And of course, this all means that, socially speaking, what were once settled farming-based communities are now becoming more and more nomadic, with permanent sod houses being replaced by teepees, the image that we see in the plains of the teepee and the quick-moving tribe. And so that's a little bit of a reversal of what we talked about with the Neolithic Revolution and the settling down of people into farm communities. And the final slide for today, once again, we are going to come full circle and to ask you who benefited the most from the Columbian Exchange. Certainly, there's a debate that you can rage between East and West, old and new, who gets the most out of this exchange here, because obviously the old world does get things from the new world that are going to be incredibly important for diversifying, food and keeping up with other certain staple crops and raw materials that are going to go towards making refined goods and economic impact in the old world. The new world seemingly gets more of these directly impactful items with the introduction of other staple crops and animals that were domesticated and all that kind of good stuff. Disease gets exchanged and has different effects on population basis, so that needs to be looked at and addressed as well within your critique and your logic understanding of benefits here. All that demographic transition and stuff makes this a very difficult question to answer. And so if you ever get an essay on this, which sometimes you get something that's close to that, you want to make sure you have a variety of ways to answer that question.